we are going to talk about what gremlins are. We all have them. Where do they come from? How do they work? How do they do what they do? And then we're going to look at how to turn gremlins into gurus. And there's some neuroscience there. If you're into that geeky kind of neuroscience stuff, there's a little bit of it. And if you're not into it, don't worry, because this is not heavy neuroscience. Then I am going to give a demonstration. I'm going to ask one of you to volunteer to work through the process with me, and we'll wrap it up from there. So I am a professional coach. I'm a full-time coach. My own coaching business is transforminglives.coach. I just at the end of October left my role as Vice President for Program Development at Quantuvos, where I oversaw the development of group coaching programs and coached individuals and from leaders from the front lines all the way up to the C-suite. And I host a podcast called Qonversations, which focuses on helping leaders meet the challenges that leadership in the 21st century provides. We currently have about 110 episodes of Qonversations up on Apple, Google, Stitcher, and all the different podcast platforms. So again, we all have gremlins. Where do they come from? Well, they started coming from us probably before we could even understand what was being said. But our parents and other adults in our lives when we were growing up. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. Some of the gremlins were very different then, but there were things like girls don't become doctors, they become nurses. Girls become teachers. Boys become lawyers and doctors. Little boys don't cry. That was one that really hit home for young boys and probably still does. Our playmates are bullies, our schoolmates are bullies, teammates, bullies. All of those feed into creating our gremlins. So if the little boy starts crying on the playground, the bullies are going to be active. So when we get a little bit further in, you'll see gremlins sometimes play a good role in our life, sometimes for all of our lives and sometimes for part of our lives. We can get gremlins from our bosses, colleagues, and subordinates, especially early in our career, or if we're in a job that really treats us more like part of the machine than a person. And books, movies, songs, plays, music, all of those feed these gremlins that we have. Gremlins are stories. Boys Don't Cry is a story. But when we hear these stories over and over again, they become our truths. And they guide how we live our lives. I often will ask my clients a rhetorical question, which is, are you a good storyteller? The truth is, we are all good storytellers. We are always telling ourselves stories and believing them. Many of those stories are our gremlins. I'm not old enough. I'm too old. I'm not young enough. I'm too young. I'm not smart enough. This is a world of scarcity. All of those are gremlins that become our truths and guide how we live our lives. So where do gremlins live? They literally live in our brains. They live in our neural networks. They live in our muscle memory. And in a few minutes, we're going to get into how do they do what they do? But before that, I want to stop and see what questions anyone. My apologies for that. Questions so far on what we've covered? Feel free to unmute or put them into the chat. Okay, so let's dive into how gremlins do what they do. We like to think of our brains as mini computers or supercomputers. They're not. The human brain is a story processor. We actually had stories before we had language. We would draw them in the dirt, we'd paint them on cave walls and on hides. When they do magnetic resonance imaging, fMRIs, of the human brain, listening to a story, they see the same pattern of brain waves as if that person was living that experience. Our brain is a story processor. Our brain actually cannot tell the difference between a well-told story and the lived event. So ask each of you to put in the chat what some of your stories are. They don't have to be gremlins. It could be a story about the job that you want or the job that you have, or a relationship. It could be a gremlin. What are some of your stories? Must live in my home city, which has since changed. That's a real story. Yeah. I will always make less than my peers. That's a story. I gave a TEDx talk back in 2020. And one of the things that I talked about at the time is, and what we're going to be talking about here, if you change your story, you can change your life. So LT changed that story about must live in my home city. TJ, you can change that story about will always make less than your peers. So let's go back to so how do the stories work? They get triggered by something. Something will trigger you to say, I will always make less than my peers. Something will trigger you to say, I must live in my home city. Something will trigger that boy at some point to hold back his tears no matter how hard he wants to cry. The story triggers our unconscious brain into action. So he may at first, and I'm going to use that example because I think it's a very good and powerful one, but translate this into your own stories. At first, hearing little boys don't cry, he may fight to hold back the tears. But over time, that becomes just how he responds to those triggers that make him want to cry. He holds it back. It's not even conscious anymore. It's not even intentional anymore. So I mentioned the brain. We're going to look at the brain for a little bit here because it's really important to understand at a very basic level how this works. When we're talking about a brain, we're talking about motor neurons, sensory neurons, ganglia, this thing in our bodies. And actually, in a moment, I'm going to tell you there are 3 of them. This thing in our bodies that collects data, analyzes data, stores data, retrieves data, and has this electrochemical activity going on. The adrenaline and the dopamine and all those things that you hear about. We actually have 3 brains, and I'm going to walk you through the science. Again, just at a high level, but it's important to understand. Not every neuroscientist will use the word brain except for the head, except for the cephalic brain. But they all agree that in our hearts, we have the same motor neurons, we have the same sensory neurons, we have the same electrochemical activity as we have in our heads. In our gut, we have the same motor neurons, the same sensory neurons, the same electrochemical activity as we have in our head. In fact, if you have ever heard anybody talk about serotonin, serotonin influences our mood, our sleep, our cognition. In our head, about 90 to 95% of the serotonin, however, is actually in our gut. So what do each of these brains do? The one in our head is the one that has language. In the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain behind your forehead. It's how you solve complex problems. It's how you experience empathy and creativity. Toward the back lower part of your head in the reptilian brain is the amygdala. This is the site of fight, flight, freeze, appease. A couple of important things here. The prefrontal cortex is actually the newest part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. It is also the part of the brain that develops last in the human fetus, and it is not fully integrated into the functioning of the brain until the late teens or early 20s, which is literally why teenagers can do dumb things, dangerous things. They don't have full use of the prefrontal cortex yet. Other important point, the prefrontal cortex is triggered in 1/10 of a second. The amygdala is triggered in 7/100ths of a second. That's 3/100ths of a second faster. If that electrochemical activity that the amygdala sends off becomes powerful enough, you don't have the ability to access the prefrontal cortex anymore. The primary functions of the cephalic brain are to perceive, to understand, to think, to make meaning, and creativity. The cardiac brain in your heart, that's where your emotions are. That's where your connection with others is. That's where your values live. Often talk about the cardiac brain as being the seat of passion, compassion, and values. In your gut, you actually have about the same number of neurons as a cat's brain. They stretch from the esophagus all the way through the digestive tract. The gut is the seat of who you are at your core. It's the seat of self-protection. It's the seat of courage. So you have all three of these brains working. Very often when I'm coaching leaders, I introduce this concept to them because they think that they have to make all their decisions only using their head. They think emotion is just this woo-woo thing. The science is it's real. Head, heart, and gut communicate. 90% of that communication is upward, from the gut to the head, from the heart to the head. Just a little bit more about this that tells you how gremlins work and helps us set the stage for how we turn them into gurus. Through your five senses, through sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, through your intuition, you receive 11 billion bits of data a second. I'd ask you to put in the chat how much of that information you think you can process. How much of that 11 billion bits of information do you think you can process? Take a guess. You got 0.01%. Let's see some other guesses. Anyone? Well, TJ, I guess you win. You're the closest guess. I don't know the percentage. It's actually about 134 plus or minus. So 10 million or 999,000, et cetera, pieces of data get filtered out every second. Those filters are in our unconscious. They were formed by the environment. If you grew up in the city and you go out into the country, you hear the silence. The silence is deafening. If you grew up in the country and you go into the city, you hear the city noise. The noise is deafening. But then it gets turned off. The noise is still there, but our unconscious filters filter it out. So we have a lot of filters, the environment, our values, our beliefs, our attitudes, our memories, our life experience, et cetera, all of those things serve to filter out most of the information that we're receiving. So again, remember, trigger, response. If we can change that cycle, if we can break that cycle, we can prepare for another response. So before we go there, any questions on what we've covered so far? Taylor, thank you. So 1/1000% gets through. Thank you, Taylor. Any questions about what we have covered so far? Okay. So now, how do we turn gremlins into gurus? I have provided Leland with a document that has everything that I'm going to cover in this section. and actually will allow you to use it as a tool for yourself in the future. I'm not sure if it's in Leland Plus yet, but if it's not, it will be shortly. So the first thing is to look at that gremlin. How would you describe them? You might describe them physically. You might describe them emotionally. You might describe them in terms of their impact on you. Again, every gremlin has served us at some point in the past, whether it was not staying after school because we listened to that gremlin that said, never talk until you're called on, or whether it's not being bullied because you don't cry when you get hurt on the playground if you're a male. Those gremlins do serve us, but they may not be serving us now. Now I sit in meetings without talking because I learned not to talk unless I'm called on. And people think I'm not participating, I'm not engaged, and so forth. So how would you describe the gremlin? How has it served you in the past? How is it not serving you now? Why is it important to turn this gremlin into a guru? This reflection really helps you prepare for getting into the process itself. And then how will you know when you succeeded? When I've succeeded, maybe now I know how and when and am able to show my emotions as a grown man, even at times when it does mean I'm crying. Or when my team says thank you for being such an active participant, I know my response is no longer going to get triggered to keep my mouth shut unless somebody asks for my opinion. So then we go one step at a time. Name the gremlin. So I'll give you, walk through here a different example. I had one client once who said, my gremlin is procrastination. I always have trouble making decisions. I always have trouble taking action. She decided she was actually going to name it Pete the procrastinator. But you can just call it procrastination, whatever works for you. Who is the guru? For her, it was Denny Decisive. So she had Pete the procrastinator. She wanted to turn into Denny Decisive. What are the triggers? So part of this document, if you choose to get it from Leland Plus, or you can set up your own tracking log. What triggered Peter the procrastinator this time? What triggered Peter the procrastinator this time? What triggered Peter the procrastinator this time? Write it down. If this is a gremlin that only comes out once or twice a week, maybe you only sit down and log a couple times a week. If this is a gremlin that comes out 8 times a day, you might want to schedule some time more than once a day to log what triggered the gremlin. What are the patterns? What this client realized is when she had to make decisions that affected others, she did not procrastinate. When she had to make decisions that only affected herself, that was the trigger. So identify what those triggers are. Now, again, going back to what we were talking about the filters. you begin to recognize, this is a decision about myself. I'm being triggered to let Pete the procrastinator take charge. I'm being triggered to let Pete take charge. I am going to select Donnie decisive instead. When we're aware of the trigger, we have a choice. Now, instead of our unconscious guiding our action, we can intentionally guide our action. And as you select that guru over and over and over again, that trigger now has an unconscious new response. You're building new neural networks and new muscle memory. So, again, questions? So, ST, you're Mr. Procrastinator, huh? Sashi? Okay. Any questions, any observations anyone wants to make before we move into a demonstration? Okay. I need a volunteer. You're not going to get rid of your gremlin in the next 25 minutes, but we're going to set the groundwork for you. Who would like to volunteer? Okay, Taylor, are you able to turn on your camera and microphone?
Hey, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I'm not able to turn on my camera. I don't know if it's a problem with my computer or in the platform.
Okay. We'll go with it this way. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Of course.
So, how would you describe your, before we get started, I'm sorry. For the others, I would ask you to observe three things. I would ask you to observe body language, but we can't see Taylor. So that's one. Observe his responses to my questions. How quickly do they come? And observe the questions I'm asking. Because you can take some of these and ask yourself as well. And I, just as a sidebar, if you will, I don't advise you to try to get rid of every one of your gremlins this way. Sometimes you need a coach. Some of them require therapy depending on where they came from and how damaging they are and so forth. Taylor, how would you describe the gremlin that you want to work on today?
I would say sometimes I have trouble speaking up. I'm a student, and a lot of times I sit in class and don't think about questions I can ask or comments I can make. And so I think that's kind of held me back from being visible in my classroom, but also in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. And when you say also in the workplace, what kind of work were you doing or are you doing?
I was in market research for the last 6 years, doing client services for consumer packaged goods companies.
Okay. And Taylor, would you describe yourself as an introvert, extrovert?
Definitely introvert.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That's helpful background. How has not speaking up served you well in the past?
I think it's prevented me from making myself look silly at times.
right?
Because there are lots of times where I'm in a call and everyone's talking about something and I have no clue what everyone's talking about, and I don't want to raise my hand and say, and ask what's going on, because then I just look silly and foolish and lose credibility. So I guess it prevents that from happening.
So it sounds, Taylor, like this is not a gremlin that you want forever gone, because it does even now serve you well sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Okay. And you already touched on why it's important to turn this gremlin into a guru. Um, would you give us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to growth in the workplace, being visible and vocal and sharing ideas is very important. Um, People want to see that you're engaged and invested, and when you just kind of sit in the background, that creates a perception that you're not invested or not involved or just not interested, and it can hold you back in the workplace.
Okay, Taylor, how will you know that you have succeeded in breaking this gremlin, if you will, into sometimes gremlin when appropriate, sometimes guru when appropriate?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think I'll know when I don't feel uncomfortable speaking up anymore and asking questions. But I don't know
Okay,
if that, I guess I don't know if that'll ever happen.
that's a story.
Yeah.
What would be a different story there?
Um, about what I just said. About,
Yeah.
I don't know if it'll ever happen. I guess a different story would be I build confidence and start to see myself differently and feel like I have something to contribute. Another story I could tell would be like when you're in a call or in a classroom and you're confused about something, there's probably like 10 other people confused about the same thing you are. And if you never ask the question, all these people are going to end up confused.
Okay. So what do you want to name this gremlin? Again, it could be a name, or it could be more of a descriptor.
Stick with the descriptor, say passiveness.
Okay. And who is the guru?
Um, Inquisitiveness,
Okay. Great. Thank you.
of course.
How inquisitive are you in your mind?
I feel like I'm pretty inquisitive for the most part. Um, it's tough though because like sometimes people will be talking about something and it's on a totally different level and you have no clue what they're talking about. So it's hard to be inquisitive other than like asking the question, what are you actually talking about? But in other settings, like they may be talking about something that's more on your level and it's easier to be inquisitive because then you can understand some of what they're talking about and you have the basis to actually ask a question that makes sense.
And Taylor, help me understand. It might
Mhm.
might mean an example when you say different level.
Yeah, so I'm an MBA student and I'm taking a derivatives class, um, which is I shouldn't have taken it because it's way above my level. And so if I were to raise my hand and ask a question, the question would be, what are we talking about?
Got it.
Um, and so like I forget the initial question we're talking about here, but like in those scenarios, inquisitiveness seems less helpful. But in settings where I feel like I have a base level of understanding of what we're talking about, asking questions about it can make more sense.
So it almost sounds, and tell me if I'm accurate here, like you need to go from a one trigger response, which is keep my mouth shut, to a two trigger response that says, I don't understand. Is this something that is at my level, or is this something that is a higher level?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of describing it.
If it's at your level, so you might want to take us into one of your other courses.
Mm-hmm.
What types of questions do you generally ask? Or not generally have, but not ask?
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, that's a good question. Maybe part of the challenge is that I don't always have great questions to ask too. Or I'm not thinking hard enough about something to have good questions to ask or comments to make. I don't know. Sorry if that's not helpful.
Everything's helpful. Everything's helpful. What would make a great question?
I think something that ties with past experience or past background. So if I'm in a class about taxes, for example, I could, tie a new tax concept to something that I've observed in the workplace and kind of ask about that. I think that would be a good question.
Okay. Let's dig into that just a little bit now. I'm an introvert too. We tend to want to reflect on things before we open our mouths. How often do you reflect on the course material before you get into the classroom that day?
Not as much as I should. But I think if I did, it would be easier to come with questions.
What would have to change in order for you to do that?
I think it would be a change in habits and managing time better. I have 3 kids, and so finding time to do all the readings and preparations before I come into class is uh, pretty challenging at times.
Welcome, Douglas. Um, what would it take to make a little more time for that reflection?
I think going to bed earlier and waking up earlier and being more conscious of using my time well throughout the day and using my planner a little bit better as well.
How important is that?
I think it's fairly important. I feel like everything kind of comes back to that. Like if you have a good question, or if you've done your research and studied beforehand and feel prepared, then you're going to be more confident in the questions you ask or the comments you make in class.
So we're going to have to wrap this up in just a minute or two. But we have Taylor, who wants to be more intentional about whether or not you want to ask a question in class, and then also to be better prepared for those questions by managing your time more fully. On a scale of 1 to 10, how prepared are you to commit to making those changes?
I give it an 8.
What would take it to a 10?
Oh, maybe. Well, we just had a new baby born a few days ago, and
Congratulations.
thank you. It's exciting, but it means that habits have to change in a lot of ways, and my wife and I need to kind of figure things out in terms of responsibilities and timing. So I feel like once we kind of get habits and routine going, I can feel a little more confident in being committed to that change.
What else would be helpful to put a bow on this, Taylor?
You mean getting to a 10?
It sounds like you're ready to commit to that as soon as you get through this newborn phase. What else would help you get rid of this sitting silently,
Oh, I see.
always gremlin?
I think, some of it goes deep to my core, like perceptions about myself. And, um, I see other people ask questions and they seem so well informed and so smart. And, you know, then I'm like, where does that question come from? Like, what experience do you have to ask a question like that? And I feel like any questions that I ask would just be so like, so much more basic, I guess. And so I think another thing that I would like to change is have more confidence that um, either I know what I'm talking about, or maybe there are other people in the class who feel the same way I do.
So I just heard another gremlin story.
There's a lot of them under there.
Again, we all have them. We all have them. We all have them. Um, that being said, as a coach, I am constantly, so in the last 6 months, I have coached pulp mill supervisors. I have coached the uh, senior executives of a multi-billion-dollar company. I don't know their business. I don't know what they're doing every day. And I can ask good questions. So that's another whole realm if you want to pursue it at another time, Taylor. But
Hmm.
I do thank you for volunteering, for being open and honest with us. And I would ask, first of all, what was that experience like for you?
It was interesting going kind of deeper into the core of where those feelings and beliefs come from. Um, I had never really tied it to like my time management before, so you kind of asking those questions and going deeper helped me see kind of where the root of the problem lies.
Okay. And what I didn't say is I don't believe in time management. We all have the same amount of time. It's the priority.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's the priority. And sometimes the family priority has to take priority.
Hmm.
We all get that. Okay. For the others, what did you observe in my questions? What did you observe in Taylor's responses? Okay, a mixture of open and closed-ended questions. Lanya, could you give me an example of a closed-ended question that I asked? Ah, absolutely. Absolutely. When I'm coaching someone, it's really important to understand how committed they are to changing whatever it is that we're talking about. And so that is absolutely one of the times when I ask closed-ended questions. I heard Taylor say a few times, that's a really good question, or I have to think about it, or something like that. That's what you often want from a coach. What else did you notice about the questions or about the responses? Absolutely. Being coached can take a lot of courage, because it means looking at ourselves and looking at where we are and what we need to change to get where we want to be next. Slashy, thank you for your comment as well. Any other observations? Okay, let me go back to the deck for just a few moments here. So if you are interested, whether it is working on your gremlins or working on asking more powerful questions or anything else, if you feel like I may be the coach for you, feel free to book a free intro call with me on the Leland platform. And if you do that and you decide to actually buy individual hours or buy a package with me, I am offering a 15% off discount through January 15th of 2025. And I will give you that code again during our intro call if you want to move into any more coaching. And with that, open to any last questions, open to if you want to stick around for just a few more minutes before the top of the hour. And if not, I thank you all for being here and being a part of this webinar today. Interesting observation, Anya. I've worked with CEOs who are wrestling with imposter syndrome as well. Thanks again, Taylor.